I'm back this month again with Peter Montgomery from the Right Wing Watch. So thanks for coming back in, Peter.
Always great to talk to you.
Yes, very good. We were just saying that I just had a conversation with Fred Clarkson, whom you know, I guess, quite well the other night, and that's coming out as a podcast episode within a few weeks here. So I'm just taking a deep dive in all stuff, Christian Reconstructionism, Dominion theology, the Christian right. And so what better way to segue into what we're going to talk about tonight?
Great.
Yeah, so we said last month, you mentioned that you wanted to look at the Texas connection. So you sent me a fantastic article. It's quite long. It's about 75, 76 pages. I was out of Rice University, wasn't it, in 2020? What can you tell us about that article?
Yeah, that was a real in-depth study put together by a guy named David Brockman, who just really kind of did a deep dive on the different elements of Christian nationalism in Texas politics, and how the religious and the political sort of feed each other in Texas.
So what he does is really a good article, because he goes through and he talks about what he calls Christian Americanism. I guess you could say Christian nationalism, and the background. He gets into a little bit of Christian Reconstructionism, but then he pulls out 11 or 12 key figures from Texas who are on the Christian right. And it's just fascinating to go through this list. I'm sure we can't get through everyone, but just real quickly, here's the people he pulls out. He talks about David Barton of Wall Builders, Glenn Beck. Some people may know some of these names better than others. David Lane, Dr. Steve Hotz, Gary North, or Hotze? Hotze, okay. Dr. Steve Hotze. You've got Gary North, Institute of Christian Economics, and of course, he's R.J. Rushdoony's son-in-law. You have a Tim Dunn and Dan and Ferris Wilkes, and they're kind of Texas money men. Then he gets into the pastors. You got Rafael Cruz, who of course is the father of Ted Cruz, Robert Jeffress, John Hagee, and Dave Welch, who is the head of the U.S. Pastors Council. So there's some really interesting figures. It's kind of a rogues gallery, isn't it, of figures on the Christian right, but they're all from Texas or associated with Texas.
That's right. And there's more, there's a lot of megachurch pastors in Texas. It's also the home to a couple of the Pentecostal ministries associated with the New Apostolic Reformation, like Cindy Jacobs, Generals International, and Chuck Pierce's Glory of Zion Ministries. So there's a lot going on there.
Well, so we got Kenneth and Gloria Copeland, as well as,
of course,
George Pearsons, who's married to Terry Copeland. That's Kenneth and Gloria Copeland's daughter, isn't it? So they have a church somewhere in Texas as well, like Eagle Mountain or something like that. It's another mega church, but he's always on the Believer's Voice of Victory. So he's a big Copeland guy too, isn't he?
Yeah, it's a big state, and it's a big state with a very serious evangelical culture. So a lot of these folks have.
Well, there's some other names. Yeah. So you mentioned some of the other guys, of course. Yeah. A lot of people would be familiar with Robert Jeffress because of the major Trump support during the whole presidency. John Hagee, maybe not as much. He's an interesting guy too, though, isn't he? Because Hagee, he's a big figure in terms of, I guess you could say, Christian Zionism, end times prophecy, support for Israel.
Yes.
So he's a big player in that sort of field.
Yeah, he's his group Kufi, Christians United for Israel, is sort of the kind of the major Christian Zionist organization, and he's occasionally popped into the news a little more back when John McCain was running for president. He accepted Hagee's endorsement, and then he got blowback from people who started posting, for example, anti-Catholic things that Hagee had said. And eventually McCain disavowed him, but it was
did he?
It was kind of a mess. But Hagee and his church were also a big part of back in 2011, when Texas Governor Rick Perry decided to run for president. He really unofficially launched his presidential bid with this huge sports stadium-sized prayer rally that had a whole bunch of the New Apostolic Reformation folks sponsoring it and speaking at it. And Hagee, who's down the road in San Antonio, he brought he filled up a whole section of the sports arena with people from his church.
All right, just bust them in, did they?
Yeah.
And then, of course, then we're talking about the political side of things. He also pulls out 6 or 7 well-known far right, or I should say evangelical right politicians. Probably the most famous one, of course, is Senator Ted Cruz. You've got Representative Louis Gilmert, as you say, former Texas Governor Rick Perry, Greg Abbott. Is he still the Texas governor now, or is they have another one?
Yeah, Greg Abbott and Paxton are still there.
Right. And then you got Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, or maybe former Lieutenant Governor, and then State Representative Dan Flynn. So these are just a few names that, again, associated with Texas politics on the right, on the Christian right. And of course, we know, well, the thing about Ted Cruz is interesting, isn't it? Because clearly Rafael Cruz is a Seven Mountains Dominion guy. And I'll play a clip in a minute that shows him preaching about this. But where's Ted Cruz at? Is he a Dominionist? He's very cagey, isn't he?
Yeah, he's more careful about that. But, he's a close ally of David Barton. He's a close ally of the Wilkes brothers. When I remember back when Cruz was still a Solicitor General in Texas, and he was kind of trying to build support on the Christian right and get his name known nationally to start running for higher office. He would come and speak at these awakening conferences sponsored by Liberty Council and a bunch of religious right groups. So he's very plugged into all of those folks, even if he's and he uses kind of the more standard political rhetoric you hear from an evangelical politician, about Judeo-Christian values, but he's very closely tied to all these folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wrote an article recently in Medium where I talked about his CPAC speech, which was not that long ago, Ted Cruz's CPAC speech. And what struck me about that, aside from sort of the cancel culture stuff that they were talking about, was he used 2 keywords that as soon as I heard him say that, it was like red flags to me. He used the word statists and he used the word collectivist. He used the word statist 3 times. Now, when I heard Ted Cruz say the word statist, I immediately thought of R.J. Rushdoony, because that is a word that Rushdoony, I don't know if he coined that word, but he certainly popularized the idea of statism. And so I went and did a deep dive into what I thought Ted Cruz meant by that use of the word statist. So I thought that was interesting.
I'll have to go look that up. I haven't seen that article, but I'm fascinated.
Yeah. Well, I was grateful because I sent it to Fred Clarkson. I've cited him in it because he talks about Rafael Cruz being a Seven Mountains Dominionist guy. What is Dominion theology and the connection to Ted Cruz? And then I riffed off of that and started kind of doing a deep dive into what did Rushdoony mean by the concept of statism and how that kind of plays out in his Christian Reconstructionism theology. And I think that's what Ted Cruz was referring to. And it's very sneaky use. Again, you couldn't say, well, Ted Cruz is a Christian Reconstructionist, but those words, to me, that's like a dog whistle type of word, isn't it? Certain people are going to know what that word means or what he's referring to, whereas a lot of people it's just not even going to register at all.
That's right. I remember when people started talking more openly about Christian Reconstructionism and Dominionism, you had some religious right leaders sort of dismissing the whole thing and said, if you talk to 100 Christians, none of them will know what Dominionism is. My reaction to that was, they might not what the term is, but the leaders do, and the leaders are feeding it to them. They don't use the term, but they're preaching the theology and the politics and the ideology.
They are. And what's interesting too, talking to Fred Clarkson the other day, we get into Christian Reconstructionism, the impact of R.J. Rushdoony on the Christian right, sort of the architecture of the Christian right. And I said to him, is it true that a lot of Christian right leaders disavowed some of the more extreme elements of Rushdoony? Now, I've never heard this said before, but what he said was actually he suspects that they actually didn't disavow. They're actually kind of keeping it on the down low. It's a pacing thing. They're saying, well, we are not going to promote those extreme ideas right now until we get in charge. Then things might change. So they may not have actually disavowed some of the more extreme elements of Rushdoony's stuff. So that'll be an interesting avenue to pursue. I don't know if you've heard that kind of line of thinking before.
That is interesting to me because, certainly some of them, when asked or when pushed, have disavowed, things like, imposition of Old Testament law and Old Testament punishments. And so I have seen some religious right figures disavow that. And certainly a lot of them will say, we're not interested in theocracy. But, I think, one of the things that I think we're going to witness, I think during the Obama years, we saw a degree of radicalization on the religious right. I think now that Biden and Harris are in power again, and so they are not in power, we're gonna see probably some more. And the way that we're seeing, more apocalyptic rhetoric that we saw leading up to the election and since.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a perfect segue maybe to go into David Barton, because here's another guy, okay, out of Aledo, Texas, wall builders. Who's David Barton? Because he's one of these ones that never comes out and says, I am a Reconstructionist, I am a Dominionist. However, you catch him at certain times, again, using the language, and we'll show a clip in a minute of him on Kenneth Copeland's Believer's Voice of Victory, talking about the importance of the 10 Commandments in American politics and jurisprudence. So we have to unpack what he's talking about there. So what do we know about David Barton?
David Barton is tremendously influential. He started his wall builders 1989. That was sort of about the same time that the Christian Coalition was getting started. And you'll hear Republican politicians and religious leaders calling Barton America's premier historian, because he has really marketed himself as a historian of American history. He collects documents from the Revolutionary War era, particularly the colonial era, to prove that the founders meant for this to be a Christian nation. And he's got this. He's obviously a very bright guy. He's got a great memory, and he talks very fast. So when he's on
rapid fire, isn't it?
He's on a TV show or radio show, he'll just kind of try to overwhelm you with, well, this founding father said this, and then this letter said this, and this person said this. And there's really, if you're not someone who's knowledgeable about those figures or those people, it's hard to rebut. But the important thing to know is, well, he calls himself, or they call him, the premier historian. He's not really a historian. And he has been repeatedly debunked by not only secular scholars, but by evangelical Christians who are legitimate historians, and who, so he wrote a book supposedly about the lies, the secularists' lies about Jefferson.
The Jefferson lies.
That was published by a major Christian publisher. But even as soon as it came out, it just was, slammed by a number of Christian scholars who said the history is wrong. They pointed so many errors that his Christian publisher pulled it off the shelf. So that is kind of a defining moment in who Barton is in terms of his the legitimacy of his claims as a historian. But he's very influential in terms of infusing the Republican Party and the religious right with this Christian nationalism and the idea that this nation was founded by and for Christians. He's been extremely influential that way, and he's not fringe in any way. He used to be one of the leaders of the Texas Republican Party. He has been for multiple election cycles a member of the Republican Party Platform Committee, active member writing the official platform for the National Republican Party. So he's an extremely influential guy.
Some other things I've learned about David Barton: he was active on the Texas State School Board for a number of years, pushing sort of a Christian nationalist agenda in Texas state school books and curriculum, which of course Catherine Stewart talks about in the Good News Club. It's such a huge thing because it sort of sets the tone, or it did, maybe not so much anymore, but other states would just sort of follow Texas's lead, wouldn't they? So if whatever worked for Texas, a lot of other states would just buy the same textbooks. And then, so that's why Texas was so important in terms of school books for, public schools.
That's right. And these Texas textbook battles go back decades. I mean, People for the American Way, the parent organization for Right Wing Watch, was involved in these battles with the religious right in the 80s and 90s. Then again, 10 or 12 years ago, when there was another cycle going on, when David Barton and other religious right activists were, knocking certain people out of the curriculum and knocking other people in, and really trying to shape what not only Texas students are reading, but students around the country.
Mm-hmm. It struck me too. Yeah, this morning I woke up early. I was watching a clip. Actually, I had to go get my COVID jab, so I didn't have to go to work first thing. So I thought, oh, I have a bit of time. I'll read that article that Peter sent me about. Then it turned out to be 75 or 76 pages long. I actually was reading it while I was waiting for the doctor at the clinic this morning to get my COVID jab. But I guess now Bill Gates can track me, I suppose, because I must have the microchip in me. But
resistance is futile.
Yeah. So I was watching a clip of David Barton, and he was doing a talk about sort of like the real history, in air quotes, about slavery. And it struck me that in his whole shtick, it's got that conspiratorial air, doesn't it? They, in air quotes, don't want you to know the truth about how slavery really was and how the founding fathers really wanted America to be a Christian nation and did found it as such. There's that conspiratorial air. And as you say, even though he's been widely debunked, I mean, I did an episode with Dr. Warren Throckmorton. He wrote a book debunking, the Jefferson lies. It doesn't matter. He's still widely accepted because he's been able to turn around and say, look, they tried to cancel me. This is the cancel culture here we're talking about, Peter. I wrote the truth, actually, and they shut me down because they couldn't handle it, man. They couldn't handle the truth, as the saying goes. Yeah. You can't handle the truth about Jefferson.
Yeah, well, Barton is big on that kind of talk, but I find with a lot of religious right folks that they are, the supposed guardians of truth, but they often have pretty little regard for it. So
very true. So shall we take a look at this clip here?
Yeah,
this is really interesting to look at David Barton. He goes into this thing about, so he appears on, this is a clip here. Can you see it now on the screen?
Yeah.
This is from August 3rd, 2018. It's on YouTube. Kenneth Copeland's Believer's Voice of Victory. There's George Pearson's, of course, as I was saying. He's another Texas man who's married to their daughter, Kenneth and Gloria's daughter. And so he has Buddy Pilgrim and David Barton on, and they're talking about the importance of sort of voting, quote unquote, biblical values and everything. What's interesting about this clip is we'll see David Barton talking about the importance of the 10 Commandments. And that leads me into the question about, his sort of Reconstructionist or Dominionist route. So let's take a look at this clip.
David, please go ahead. Pick up.
Well, you go through, so you do all of that. Yeah. And then priorities become important because we've all got things that are important to us. If I'm in energy, our ranch is out in the middle of one of the counties in Texas that's just solely energy. Yeah. And that's a big deal to all of them. And that's good that energy is, but don't forget that God has his priorities. We talked the first day about how God gave 613 laws. Then he said, here's my top 10. Right. And so top 10, all right, public religious acknowledgments. Don't get somebody that's a secularist and wants God out of the public square. Next thing is LGBT, transgender, homosexual marriage, homosexuality. God's real clear on, I want sex confined to a man and a woman inside marriage. Right. So he's made it real clear, man and a woman, so that's your genders. Made it real clear that's inside marriage, so anything outside, whether it's homosexual sex, anything else, marriage is a man and a woman, definition. Then the third thing is don't commit murder. Kill is, in Hebrew, is murder. Don't shed innocent blood. That's abortion. But energy is my thing. Good. That's my number 4 thing, because here's my top 3. I vote these 3 things first. And if I've got candidates that are good on religious expression, religious conscience, if I got candidates that are good on life, and I've got candidates that are good on marriage and sexuality and LGBT, then I'll vote energy 4th. But don't put energy up first if God hadn't put it first. So what a Christian has to do is keep first what God said first, seek first my kingdom and my righteousness, and all this other stuff will get added to you. So that's the priority. You go into that kind of a priority on voting. And if you vote righteousness, you will get blessed. And that's one of the things that makes all ships, rising tide makes all ships rise. Right. When righteousness goes up, even the wicked get more blessed. They may not know why, but the nation is being blessed and everything goes up with it.
All right. So that's Kenneth, on Kenneth Copeland's Believer's Voice of Victory. Really interesting stuff, isn't it, Peter? I mean, that last piece, the rising tide lifts all ships, even the wicked get blessed. They don't even know why. It's because we're putting righteous people in office. That's a Dominionist sort of mantra, surely, isn't it?
It is, and and I was struck also at the very beginning when he's pulling out the 10 Commandments, and he very quickly turns the first commandment, "I am the Lord thy God," into somehow saying you can't have secularists in public office.
Exactly.
And that was
incredible exegesis.
That was quite a leap,
Yeah.
But it's interesting, but because while he markets himself and is marketed as a historian, he does a lot of that kind of biblical exegesis that you would often have
creative exegesis,
pastor or a theologian. There's one of the books that he was heavily involved in is something called the Founder's Bible, and it is a full copy of the Bible interspersed throughout with all kinds of essays and right-wing commentary on various parts of the Bible. And he was really instrumental in that and is responsible for a lot of the material. And in that, he really plays out a lot of the sort of other worldview stuff that is very aligned with Reconstructionists, in saying that, the idea that God has created these certain jurisdictions, and so there's really no legitimate biblical role for the government to be dealing with poverty or education or taking care of the sick, because God didn't give that job to government. He gave those jobs to families in the church. And Barton, has unique interpretations of Jesus' parables that lead him to say that Jesus was against the minimum wage, Jesus was against unions, Jesus was against progressive taxation, Jesus was against the capital gains tax. So it's that all of that piece gets folded into his politics too. It's the sort of the anti-government piece of it that feeds in very much to the modern day Republican Party and also to the modern day religious right.
And it strikes me too, as you say, going back to the Reconstructionist piece, you saw the move that he made. So I've seen him talk about the 10 Commandments on other clips before, and that's his shtick. He says God gave 613 laws in the Old Testament, but these are his top 10. And so that's why they need to be really, looked at very carefully. And, they're the kind of the cream of the crop. But then when he goes into each of the 10, as you say, suddenly it's like, wait, what now? So thou shalt not kill is a prohibition against abortion. And somehow he's got anti-LGBTQ stuff in there. So you got the gender in there. You're like, whoa, hang on a minute. But this is a great example of that sort of gaslighting, the spin that Barton is so effective at. It sounds really good. It sounds convincing. But when you actually break it down and go, how did he get from A to B to C? There's a lot of non sequiturs in there, isn't there?
There is a lot of non sequiturs. And when he's applying that tactic to his government, his teachings about government, that's when he uses all his colonial era documents in his old books and waves them around and quotes from them to say, there he waved the 10 Commandments. That's the authoritative piece that then he riffs off of. So, but he also likes to do that with all these, old historical documents that then he riffs off of. And there's not usually a legitimate historian sitting next to him to say, wait a minute.
Challenge that. Well, and you think about, again, like I say, with the Rushdoony piece, essentially that was Rushdoony's argument. I think what Barton has done is he's softened it a bit. He hasn't disavowed it, but he's popularized it. He never talked about stoning gays and incorrigible teens and all that. That was what Rushdoony said. But even the idea, the notion that the Old Testament law, and specifically the Ten Commandments, should still have bearing on voting choices today and for the average Christian, that it still has an impact somehow in American life and whatever pursuit of liberty you want to call it. That to me again it's a Rushdoonian kind of sort of move, isn't it? The pushing of the Old Testament and specifically the Ten Commandments. I mean, Rushdoony's Institutes of Biblical Laws was a running commentary on the Ten Commandments.
Yeah.
It happens to be like almost 2,000 pages long, but basically I think he's culling from a lot of Rushdoonian sort of ideas on the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, Julie Ingersoll, who's a religion scholar who did a great book on Christian Reconstructionism that Oxford published several years ago. She calls Barton Reconstructionist light. It's her way of sort of saying what you're saying, that he is a kind of a popularizer and softener, but he is definitely part of the through line of those ideas, which are spread very widely in the religious right.
Yeah. So we've got a bit of David Barton, but now let's take a look at Rafael Cruz. So the question is, to what extent is Ted Cruz a Dominionist? We know now that his father, I guess he fled Cuba as seeking political asylum under Castro's regime, and he's now a pastor out of Texas as well. So there's an interesting clip here where he talks about Seven Mountains Mandate and Dominion theology on this David Sparks channel. It's just a couple minutes long.
There are some of you, as a matter of fact, I will dare to say the majority of you, that your anointing is not an anointing as priest. It's an anointing as king. And God has given you an anointing to go to the battlefield. And what's the battlefield? The battlefield is the marketplace. To go to the marketplace and occupy the land. To go to the marketplace and take dominion. If you remember the last time I was on this pulpit, I talked to you about Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, where God says unto Adam and Eve, go forth, multiply, take dominion over all my creation. And if you recall, we talked about the fact that that dominion is not just in the church. That dominion is over every area: society, education, government, economics.
Okay, there you go. That's Rafael Cruz laying it out in the most clear terms.
Absolutely.
That is Seven Mountains Mandate, Dominion theology. Unfortunately, this guy doesn't let him finish his all seven, but he does he lays them all out, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean that, there's that's, as you said, it's about as clear as it gets.
Yeah, and the Genesis 1, 26 through 28, that is the Dominion mandate. That's where Rushdoony started. That's where they start, where God is speaking to Adam and Eve in the garden in the book of Genesis, and he says exactly, take dominion. But they take it to mean like a political, and it's interesting too, he said, it's not just taking dominion over the church, it's all these other aspects, these spheres or mountains of society.
Yeah, and that's really that is the driving force behind a lot of the religious right today. Both the people who sort of embrace the language of who will admit to calling themselves dominionists, or who overtly teach Seven Mountains dominionism, but it's also a lot of people who would not apply the term dominionism to themselves, but they use that Seven Language Mountains rhetoric. I mean, that's all across the religious right, and that to me is a sign of how effectively people like Barton and others have done that. And I actually think part of that has been as a political strategy to bring disparate elements of the religious right more in alignment so they can work more effectively together as a political movement. I think that, Southern Baptists whose theology is not the theology of the Pentecostal Dominionists, but they talk about the seven mountains in the spheres of culture because they're trying to work together to get conservative Christians involved in politics and voting for right-wing candidates. So, the sort of political imperative, I think, has driven some of this theological fuzziness or embrace of the Christian Reconstructionist concepts.
I think you're absolutely right. They've set aside some of their theological distinctives in order to achieve a more common aim. Because, for example, when I was an evangelical, we used to get in huge arguments over things like eschatology, end times belief. I can remember sitting in Bible college, 25 years ago or whatever it was, and having these massive arguments over, when's Jesus going to return? He's going to return before the rapture. No, it's going to be post-millennial. Rushdoony was a post-millennialist. He wrote a book ranting and railing against premillennialists, saying they were heretics and all the rest of it. They were reading the Bible wrong and getting it all wrong, so they are not going down that line anymore, are they? They can't afford to argue the finer points of theology, can they?
No, they really aren't. And they're very explicit about setting that aside for their, common political goals. It's interesting. I think this is a little anecdote about when they were kind of first trying out some of this more closer working together between the fundamentalists and the Pentecostal folks right after Obama's election. And it was Obama's election really drove a lot of this because, he put the fear of God into people.
Literally.
And at one of the first big coalition events at Liberty University, where they had sort of welcomed into what I might think of as the traditional religious right, the sort of Cindy Jacobs and the Lou Engles of the world. And Lou Engle was on stage and there were some musicians on stage. And one of the musicians started speaking in tongues, and which clearly had violated some kind of agreement with Liberty University that nobody was going to speak from tongues, because I think it was Lou Engle ran up to the microphone, profusely apologized, that this was
sorry.
sorry.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Oh man.
So there are still distinctives like that in worship and theology, but yes, they have they don't spend much time worrying about that. They don't spend much time worrying about pre or post millennial in terms of their political organizing, other than I will say that I have heard at some of the Dominionist events them explaining why they don't like rapture theology, in that it encourages Christians to be complacent, that God's going to take care of the church, so why do I need to go spend my weekends, knocking on doors for politicians? And that somehow rapture theology makes Christians lazy, and rather than trying to make the church triumphant. So, so I've heard some of that, but it's not a big focus. Not nearly as important to them as trying to get Trump reelected was, for example.
Yeah, hugely important. Well, if people are not interested in reading a 75 or 76 page article, here's one I pulled up from the Texas Observer by that same guy that you sent me that article, David Brockman. This was written in 2016. And he's interesting too, because I guess this was probably the run up to the article that he did a few years later. It's an expanded article, but here he talks about dominionism in the Christian right and why so specifically so much of it comes out of Texas. One of the people we haven't talked about is Gary North. He's another one. So we need to get into Gary North. We said he was R.J. Rushdoony's son-in-law, but he's running the Institute in Christian Economics out of Tyler, Texas. What do we know about Gary North?
Well, and he's one of the people who is pretty explicitly a Christian Reconstructionist. You know, he's
No
not
doubt
one
about
of
it.
the,
He's a card-carrying Reconstructionist.
so he's yeah, and I don't follow him as closely, but I also believe that I think that Julie Ingersoll's book talks a little about him and his connection to the homeschooling movement, which is another thing we haven't really touched on, but that's
No.
that has been a huge way in which Christian Reconstructionist ideology has been spread and is through Christian homeschooling.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I've talked about this on other podcasts. I talked with Dr. Milton Gaither specifically about the history of Christian homeschooling and the connection that Rushdoony had. I would say, I asked him this, you know, would there be Christian homeschooling as we know it today if it was not for the work of R.J. Rushdoony? And he said, yeah, that's basically it. He was such a major player back in the, I guess, late 70s and into the 80s, going all over the country, arguing in court cases for parents' rights to homeschool children, which in a lot of states was technically illegal at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That was part of why he helped push it over the line to get states to say, yes, okay, it's legal to homeschool your kids, just purely from a legal point of view, not necessarily a Christian one. But of course, that was his agenda.
Right. And the interesting thing about that too is that the man who really helped build Christian homeschooling into a political force through the Homeschool Legal Defense Network is a guy named Michael Ferris,
Mm-hmm.
who really kind of led that effort and got homeschooling, legalized across the country. He has since moved to the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is
he's the head of ADF now, isn't he?
That's the most important Christian right legal group, which is trying to push this biblical worldview into law and policy. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the other connection with Ferris, of course, is he founded Patrick Henry College in 2000, which is really interesting. I got into this the other night with Fred Clarkson because I'm in the midst of, I guess I've written a book on, I've just done so much research that I've got enough content for a book on Rushdoony's influence sort of from a theological point of view. And then I go into Patrick Henry College and sort of the modern iterations of Rushdoony's vision, because what you have with Patrick Henry, of course, is I guess it's about 75 or 80% of its student body are homeschool graduates, with a specific aim to train them up to basically infiltrate politics, the legal field, as in a dominionist sort of way, I would say. What's your take on Patrick Henry?
No, I think that's exactly right. It was very explicitly founded, both to give a place where Christian homeschoolers could send their kids to college and not worry that all the hard work they've done inculcating this biblical worldview was going to be, destroyed by some Marxist professor. But also with the explicit goal of creating a feeder into, and when you had, when there are Republican-controlled administrations, when there's Republicans in the White House, that has worked. They've been able to place, interns into a lot of positions in government service. Mm-hmm. And I believe that one of the young, hard right folks who was just elected to Congress and who is making a name for himself as quite an annoyance, Madison Cawthorn.
Yeah, I was going to bring him up.
Attended Patrick Henry.
Only for a term, I guess.
Yeah, he did not succeed there.
Yes, and in fact, he's now in all kinds of trouble. Although the story seems to be fading in importance. When it first came up, that's what struck me. Was I looked into the situation because, of course, here's another politician being accused of sexual harassment and all the rest of it. Then I saw the Patrick Henry connection, and I thought, aha, he was a homeschool graduate. That's for sure. Madison Cawthorn, he was a homeschooler. Then he went to Patrick Henry just for a semester, I guess. And part of that, and that's where all these allegations come out of, was his time at Patrick Henry, where he was accused of basically being a stalker and a creeper, taking girls for rides in his car. Even though he was in a wheelchair, he obviously could still drive. And he's a very, stalkerish kind of person.
Yeah, and it is kind of remarkable that he hasn't really been accountable for that, even though
Yeah.
more information has come out about
Yeah.
it. And
Crickets. Look at Al
the
Franken. Al Franken resigned over some photographs, pretty much, wasn't it? Yet this guy's been accused credibly by multiple women of sexual harassment, and he's doubled down, and in fact he's actually lied about his backstory too. That was
yes,
part of the other thing, how he actually ended up in a wheelchair. He said his friend abandoned him in a burning car, and his friend was like, "No, I pulled you out of that burning car. What are you talking about?" So
right.
he's a liar anyway.
He's claimed it was the accident that kept him from attending the military academy
Exactly.
when he had already been rejected. I mean,
Yeah.
he's been caught in
just
a
full of
lot of
holes.
lies.
Yeah, but again, we had Trump for 4 years. I mean,
Well,
he was a guy who lied constantly.
And this is where, I mean, that's where, the embrace of Trumpism has really, left the Republican Party in this position.
Yeah.
How can you hold people accountable for lying or for sexual harassment when the person that you have held up as the savior to the party and the country is Donald Trump, who, so it's, so there's, a lot of calls for investigations of Governor Cuomo, and I think those investigations need to happen, given that there's been credible allegations against him on sexual harassment. But I don't see any of the Republicans calling for that for Madison Cawthorn, or for
Kavanaugh is another one.
Asking in the caucus whether the caucus should be disavowing Cawthorn.
Yeah.
So,
well, they barely got Marjorie Taylor Greene. They booted her off of one committee, I guess, but that was the extent of it. They had to do something, I guess. They didn't censure her. They didn't do anything and all that. And so now it's come to find out that the investigation into Brett Kavanaugh's backstory of, again, credibly accused of sexual harassment, and now his debts have magically disappeared. It turns out what's going on there. Crickets. Where's the investigation into Kavanaugh?
Yeah, and now we see now that Trump is out of power, certainly the Republicans are in Congress are turning their focus on smearing Joe Biden's nominees and going after them. They're certainly not interested in any sort of self-reflection or taking a look at what's going on in their own caucus.
Yeah, it's true. I've been going through Stephen Hassan's book, The Cult of Trump, and that's just really fascinating because it's a deep dive into obviously the cult psychology. He goes way into it, and it makes me think, okay, we've just lived 4 years of this stuff, and I'm reflecting on, as he describes, all the cultish stuff that went on in the Trump era and is still going on. I mean, QAnon's not going anywhere, is it? We've got another Texan we haven't talked about, and that's Alex Jones. You could put him on the Christian right. Apparently, we saw that clip a couple months ago, didn't we, where he spoke at one of those rallies in Washington, D.C., and I was surprised. He was like spouting Christian rhetoric, talking about the second coming of Jesus and all the rest of it. I didn't know. Apparently, Alex Jones is a Christian now.
Well, I think Alex Jones has decided that that's his, way back into maybe back into visibility and back into influence within the right, is to just full on embrace the Christian nationalism. He did that at a rally in December and at the rally the day before the insurrection. So yeah, I think you never know. And people always ask me, which of these guys is a true believer and who's just being cynical? And I say, you can never know for sure.
You can never know. They're so good at hiding. No one knows. And there's no accountability, isn't it? I mean, I can remember, again, when I was an evangelical, one of the things that always struck me about the televangelists, and in the midst of scandal after scandal, going back to the 80s, Jim Bakker, Jimmy Swaggart, so many people, Peter Popoff getting caught, and Robert Tilton, and all these people, there's no accountability, none. I mean, they're not pastors of, well, some of them are, but, they're not in a denomination that when they do something, no one can come along and remove them from their position. They maybe have a little repentance and then they're back in. Look at Jimmy Swaggart. He fell big time. That should have been the end of him, and it's not. He's back. He's still doing his thing. Yeah,
well, and that's interesting too. Particularly these big megachurch pastors and television ministries that are outside of denominational structures. Even some of the big Pentecostal megachurches, they used to be part of Assemblies of God, but they separated themselves. And, one of the reasons people want to be independent is because, as you said, then there is no accountability structure.
Sure.
There's maybe a board that has their family and friends on it. And so that's why there's often, so little accountability for how money is spent, how people are treated. On the rare occasion, one of these folks is held accountable, it's often by secular authorities. Last year, Jim Baker, speaking of someone who has come back on Christian television,
selling pizza buckets,
selling
among other
buckets.
things.
That's right.
Colloidal silver and whatever else is crap.
Well, he was, he had someone on selling this silver product.
Yeah, colloidal
touting
silver
as a possible cure for COVID.
Yes, he got in trouble over that too, didn't he?
And then he had a few state attorneys general go after him on those kind of claims. But yeah, it's not like there was anybody within the movement or within Christian television holding him accountable for that. That was the legal system.
Exactly. If it's just secular, and then which gives him ammunition to turn around and say, look, they're coming after me again, just like David Barton. They came after me.
Yeah. And
tell them the truth.
One of the interesting things here, and, one of the interesting things about the religion, politics, and the intersections of that is there are always fuzzy lines. People who are in First Amendment law, the courts have been for years figuring out just where the line for the Establishment Clause and so there's often judgment calls, and there's often, people of good faith can disagree on a particular episode or not. But, folks on the right have really been staking out now this position that that the church is an equal sovereign, that the government has no authority to tell it what to do on anything. And, that has really come up around during the pandemic, where, a lot of church leaders have strongly objected to governors and local health officials' restrictions on gathering and worship, or restrictions on, having a choir sing indoors or anything like that. And so I think that during the last year, I've seen a real escalation in the kind of religious liberty and religious persecution rhetoric by megachurch pastors and by religious right legal groups, just saying that that it's tyranny. It's tyranny.
Yeah, government overreach.
Government in any way to try to restrict the church, to try to restrict the church and how it gathers and how it worships. And you can disagree with how the health officials or how the governor draw the line, but they're saying that there is no legitimate line, that the church can't be regulated in any way.
Which again is interesting, because going back to Rushdoony, so much of this comes back to Rushdoony, his sphere sovereignty. You had the state, the church, and the family, and anything that encroached on the spheres of the family and the church, which was obviously going to be the statism. So there's Ted Cruz, and that was Ted Cruz's point, was that the statists don't want you to have any fun. The statists are the ones coming in and wrecking everything because they want to destroy our precious liberties. And that's echoing exactly that line you just talked about, isn't it? Look at Dr. John MacArthur in California. He's another mega church pastor who's recently gotten in trouble for flouting these COVID protocols, so it's a common line now, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's, in the same way that, for a lot of Trump supporters, flouting mask regulations became seen as a test of their manhood or a test of their commitment to liberty to not wear a mask, because mask requirements were tyranny. You really see, on the religious right, a lot of these right-wing pastors and ministry leaders shaming pastors who go along with public health restrictions, and like just pouring scorn on them for, bowing the knee to Pharaoh, and so there's just been a tremendous amount of rhetoric against public health restrictions, and the sense that this is a test of your faith, whether you're willing to stand up and resist those.
Yeah. Well, we saw last month or two with the Greg Locke piece. He's one of these angry preachers, isn't he, who's getting his 15 minutes of fame right now. And it's working, as we said, right now. And someone told me that what seems to be working is these people they're drawing a line in the sand, and that's attracting a bunch of followers. So that's why a Greg Locke, he's becoming this firebrand, and it's attracting, like Trump, a certain segment or demographic of society, American society, to him, because they're like, yeah, that guy's saying out loud what we're all thinking, so we can rally around him. It'd be interesting to watch Greg Locke's trajectory, where he ends up going when all this is over.
Yeah. I think it'll be interesting to see in the future historians who look back. My not well thought through thesis, though, is that, we just recently saw Rush Limbaugh pass, but I think that Rush Limbaugh, he kind of paved the way for people like Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity and Lou Dobbs, that basically made it that being a jerk was cool, being cruel and showing contempt for your opponents, that was the manly thing, and that was the cool thing. And so that's, Trump didn't invent that. The right wing, that path had been paved by right wing radio and TV hosts before Trump ever decided to run, but he took full advantage of it.
Sure.
So I think you're right. People like Greg Locke are the pastor equivalent of that. They see, they want the kind of crowds that loved Trump, taunting and heaping abuse on the media and on political correctness. That worked, and he got adoring crowds, and he became president. And so I think a lot of pastors like Greg Locke was like, hey, it worked for him.
It worked
for me.
Well, and you had Father Coughlin. He was the forerunner to all this stuff. Back in the 20s and 30s, till he finally got ran out. So yeah, you've had that playbook, haven't you, on the Christian right for decades and decades. Well, I know we're running out of time here. I was thinking we didn't talk about another, I don't know if he's from Texas, but Vision Forum, Doug Phillips. So maybe next month, I've actually had a request from a listener that said she wanted to have us take a deep dive into Vision Forum, Doug Phillips. There's a whole story there. There's a Dominionist Reconstructionist piece, homeschooling curriculum. And I think they were based out of Texas as well, weren't they?
I think so.
And there was a huge scandal. He was accused of grooming a woman that lived with them and sexually abusing her for years. And then the whole thing imploded. So what's going on with Vision Forum, or it's gone now, but I mean, what was the story? That might be an interesting connection to look at next time. So thank you once again, Peter. It's been absolutely great again talking to you, and hopefully we can look into maybe Vision Forum and keep looking at this Texas connection maybe next month.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, there's a lot of those Texas guys we haven't gotten to yet.
So many of them, yeah. The great state of Texas. We have nothing against Texas, but it's just for some reason, well, and I mean, we know that their attitude about energy got them into trouble in this storm, didn't it? This sovereignty idea that we don't need any other power grids. And then when they went down, they were on their own, literally. So there's something going on with the state kind of mentality, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Peter.
Great
I'll talk
to
you next month. Have a good month, and I'll see you again.
All right. Bye-bye.